So, good afternoon and good morning, everyone, especially those of you joining us from the West Coast. Thank you for attending today's webinar. As you may know already, my name is Victoria Thacker, and I will be your host for today's session. This webinar is brought to you by the British Columbia branch of the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, the only global qualifying organization in Canada where you can become a chartered governance professional. For further information about our programs, webinars, or events, I invite you to visit our website at www.cgiofcanada.ca. Before we begin our presentation, please note, as per our usual CPD sessions, everyone has been muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat because we welcome all questions and will flag them for the speaker. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our esteemed speaker, Mr. Hardeep Mehrotara. With over 20 years of experience in information technology and cybersecurity, Hardeep currently serves as the Vice President in Information Technology and Cybersecurity. A recognized expert in his field, he's been featured on CTV as well as Global TV and was named one of Securities Magazine's top cybersecurity leaders in 2023. In addition to his leadership roles in both the private sector and the Canadian forces, Hardeep contributes to academic programs at institutions like BCIT, SFU, and KPU. So a little bit of a celebrity here today. So please join me in welcoming Hardeep Mehrotara.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate that. And thanks for the kind introduction there. It's a real pleasure and honor to speak with each one of you. As we were chatting earlier, and, I do get a chance to chat with various executives, board members. I've also spoken to a number of cybersecurity and tech professionals, but, I think this is really quite an honor to actually speak to a really different audience and especially individuals that are really responsible for overall governance of an organization. So quite the pleasure and quite the honor actually today to speak to one of you. Today, what I wanted to have a chat about was the importance of cyber resilience. So when you look at overall governance of an organizations, we're all starting to see there's a significant rise of cyber incidents on a daily basis, right? If any of you have seen the recent report that was published by the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity, you can see there's, year by year, there is an exponential rise of cyber incidents. Some of them state sponsored, but majority of them are typical cyber criminals, trying to really kind of make money and monetize on these cyber incidents, right? However, the disruption that's being caused by these incidents to organizations and businesses is an average cyber incident, I think, is around anywhere between 4.5 to $6 million. And that's just the cost of dealing with a cyber incident, and that doesn't even include reputation damage after, right? What we're also seeing from a trend perspective is 9 out of 10 leaders today or executives are actually asking for the adoption of AI, which is artificial intelligence, right? So if you look in 2025 compared to 2023, there's this exponential growth of AI. Well, what does that mean from a cyber perspective? Well, AI is all about data. Initially it was all about generative AI, which is just generating content. Now we're starting to see a whole new element of AI, which is more agentic AI, which is actually being used AI for decision making. Given the push for AI, what we're starting to see is the importance of governance of data and the importance of governance of cyber significantly increasing because there's a number of different risks that we'll talk about today. And then I think coming back to, cyber resilience, and we'll chat a little bit about that, why that is so important, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when a cyber incident is going to occur. You may have all the governance pieces in place, as I would highly recommend, having governance frameworks and cyber governance frameworks that are in place. However, resilience is really what I'm encouraging organizations to be focusing on. So I want to make sure that the presentation today is very interactive. Feel free to ask questions as you go. There will be a time to ask questions in the end, but if you've got a burning question, just feel free to feel free to put it in the chat. We'll pause. We'll work through those questions, and I want to kind of keep it more interactive today. Okay, so kind of what I was referring to earlier. We're starting to see this trend around, growing speed of cyber incidents. With the advent of whether it's automation, machine learning, and AI, we're starting to see a significant increase in the number of cyber incidents. However, it's not just the number that I'm more concerned about, it's the speed and the pace and the sophistication of these cyber incidents that is significantly growing, right? Just a quick, this is from the Verizon data breach report. If you haven't seen that, highly encourage you guys to download a copy. They publish one every year. They analyze hundreds of medium to large organizations around the world. And they publish some interesting stats. And one of the stats that you can see, from 2018 to 2024, the cost of a data breach is increasing year by year, right? And part of that is the reason behind that is we're starting to see like double and triple extortion that's being used by cyber criminals, right? What we're starting to also see is the response time for cyber incidents is also, is also growing, right? So we're starting to see that the amount of time that the organization, like the companies are, sorry, the cyber criminals are within your organization and navigating through, and the time that it takes to respond to these incidents is also growing, right? Because of the speed. So the top 5 incidents that we are normally seeing is, I know everybody's heard of phishing, but what we're seeing a lot of is cyber criminals are, scoping the dark web. They're going through and compromising credentials and using that to gain access to other organizations, right? When we look at the threat landscape across, from a cyber perspective, I've kind of bucketed them into these 4 major categories, right? When I speak to a lot of like, executives, the boards of organizations, or these are kind of the 4 buckets that we're starting to see a trend. Initially it used to be just a virus or something on your computer, or we heard a little bit about ransomware, right? But now we're starting to see very, very sophisticated type of attacks. And we're going to see this, over the next couple of years grow exponentially, right? So we talked a little bit about the advent of artificial intelligence. So what we're seeing is actually cyber criminals actually using machine learning and AI in their attacks, right? So they're using AI, just like how we use AI. We're starting to, executives are pushing us to use AI within organizations. The cyber criminals are using AI to generate more and more sophisticated phishing emails, and they're becoming more authentic in nature, right? Using large language models, right, like ChatGPT and other types of malicious GPT type of models to basically make it more authentic, right? Now, I remember there used to be a time where you'd get a phishing email and there's be like spelling mistakes and errors, and you'd be able to very quickly be able to say, oh yeah, that's phishing, like, that can't be possible. But now you can see very conversational based emails that are coming through and very, very hard to detect, right? We're also seeing the advent of deepfakes. So we're seeing using a lot of the threat intelligence that we get. We're seeing deepfakes being used, whether it's in voice deepfakes, so cyber criminals using that to contact like banks or contact, help desks, and use voice deepfakes as a way to pretend to be somebody else, or like an employee, to then gain access to that company, right? We're also seeing the use of deepfakes in when there's a ransomware attack and as a triple extortion. So they'll create a deepfake of an executive and use that deepfake to send like a malicious message, right? To tarnish the reputation of the company, right? So just, overall, like we're starting to see like very sophisticated attacks. But what we're also seeing is the speed and the pace of these attacks getting a lot faster, right? Because with the advent of AI and automation, you can move a lot faster within an organization that manually you had to move from one system to another. The second trend that we're starting to see is, ransomware is becoming more of a commodity type of attack now. So No longer it's just like, hey, someone's creating the ransomware. So we're seeing like brokers that are creating the ransomware and then selling it to somebody else. So as almost like a script kiddie, you can literally go onto the dark web. You can log on and you can pick one of these ransomware as a service type of sites and pick the organization you want, point it, and literally launch a ransomware. And it basically coordinates the entire campaign for you, right? So no longer you need to have like very sophisticated technical skill sets to be able to do that. And the people that run this, they just take a cut out of it, right? So it's kind of like, someone they're not actually even launching the attack, they're just taking a cut out of what they've done, and the other person is just cashing out of, whatever they get, the profits they get out of the ransomware, the company that they've compromised, right? And it's a very interesting model. We're starting to see more and more of it. What I'm trying to say there is someone that's why we're starting to see a significant increase in ransomware, because people that are not no longer technically, super competent, or, they don't have to be super technical, super savvy, are now able to do this, right? And cash out very, very quickly. And then it's part of the ransomware. We're seeing, as I said, we're seeing double and triple extortion. So, launch the ransomware, and next thing you know is, the AI or deep fakes, or they steal your data. And then once they've cashed out on the money on the ransomware, then they'll be like, okay, now if you don't want us to leak the data, we're gonna, you need to pay us more. So we're starting to see, double and triple extortion mechanisms by cyber criminals in that space. The other area that is kind of like is I wouldn't say it's new, but we're starting to see an increased trend is as we see IoT and OT networks grow within organizations, is we're starting to see like attacks against these traditional old school networks, right? Because if you look at these IoT and OT networks, they typically don't have the same cyber controls that normal other networks would have, right? So the cyber criminals are getting smarter, and they're saying, okay, well, your general network or general, has all these cyber controls and frameworks and governance that's put in place. However, why would I go after that? I'd rather go after the easy aspect. And then that's why we're starting to see a lot of like OT networks that are getting attacked. And there's been incidents where we're seeing like, I'm sure everybody here works in an office building, and we're starting to see like building automation systems, access control systems, even cameras. Like there was recently a recent article that was put in place where they tried to attack this company initially, and they couldn't get in. So then they found, hey, an access control camera or access control system and a camera system. And then they used that as a way to then gain access to the network and deploy ransomware. So when you look at governance, I would encourage you to encourage your teams to really not only just look at just traditional IT networks, but also focus on other areas of the networks. Anything that is connected, whether to the internet or connected to the network, right? And then the last one that we saw this many years ago. There was an incident, SolarWinds incident. If anybody's heard of this, right? Where it was where it's the easiest path, right? So if you're using any vendors or any technology vendors or even business vendors, business systems, you may have all the controls in the place. However, a lot of the cyber criminals, what they're looking at, they're like, okay, what are the pieces of software that are used by a number of large organizations across the world, and they're trying to infiltrate those organizations, to basically plant malicious code, right? Because and that's where I say the third party risk. So from a governance perspective, I would say we're seeing a huge trend in here where third-party suppliers, so it may not be your organization that is compromised, it may be, a partner that you're working with, or software vendor, or technology vendor, or a business vendor that you work with. And they gain access to that, and then you're sharing information, or you're collaborating on documents, things, and they have access to your systems, and then that's a vector to gain access to your environment, right? So, you know, I know I remember asking this question a little while ago to another set of audience around how many people actually have a full inventory of all your third parties and looked at your third party contracts, right? And do you even have a plan if your third party was breached, right? Like, what would you do? Do you have any playbooks? Do you have any, like, what steps would you take, right? And the answer was like, we were working on it, right? And I would encourage you, like from a governance perspective, this is an area definitely, is usually overlooked at, right? So I would highly encourage, when we look at from an overall governance perspective, focus on those third parties, at least those key vendors that you have key dependencies on. Just wanted to pause. Any questions so far in the chat there? Just wanted to see. No? Okay, perfect. Okay. We chatted a little bit about AI, and I wanted to kind of dive a little bit on this. And there was a recent report, and it was published by Mandy and Google. Highly encourage you, if you're interested in knowing a little bit about what's going on in the industry around cyber and threat intelligence. I don't work for Google or Mandiant, but I do say that they do publish some really good threat intelligence. And there was a recent report that was published by them around the types of cyber attacks that we're starting to see using AI. And we talked a little bit about that, about cyber criminals using AI. And, right on, the one thing that we're starting to see is obviously, we call it APT threat actors. These are the nation state threat actors. We're starting to see trends where nation state threat actors are using APT. There's evidence of them using different, whether it's Gemini or other types of malicious GPT type of large language models to generate attacks, right? Or help them with even reconnaissance activities to get information about a company or an organization, right? But on the right hand side of the screen, I don't know if you guys see it. There's a screenshot here of Ghost GPT. This is an actual malicious GPT that's been created, and anybody can download it and access it, right? So a lot of people ask me, what is that? So when you use ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or Gemini, there's some guardrails that are built into it, right? So if you ask it a question about certain things, it'll probably say, I don't know the answer, or it'll say I can't do X, Y, Z, right? Whereas some of these large language models or Ghost GPT, what they allow you to do is those guardrails are removed, right? So if it's please go and create me a piece of a virus or give me some malicious code that will allow me to do X, Y, Z, it will go ahead and do that for you, right? And what that does is, again, someone that doesn't have a lot of knowledge or programming knowledge or even IT knowledge can actually very quickly now be able to do things that they weren't able to do, right? So we're starting to see, as I said, we're starting to see a lot of use of AI in phishing. Like phishing still continues to be the number one way of how attacks, 90% of attacks start, right? We're seeing a lot of websites and a lot of services that are popping up around deep fakes. I'm sure everybody here has probably seen videos of some celebrities doing some interesting or saying some interesting things on whether it's on TikTok or some other pieces. But we're actually seeing this now being, as I said, used to tarnish reputation of organizations. And just even last week, I was doing a talk and we were talking about crisis management. Something that most organizations haven't thought about is like, what would you do or how would you deal with a situation where whether there's an employee or a senior executive and there is a malicious deepfake that's been created of that person and is saying something controversial? How would you deal with that as an organization, right? Something to think about from a governance perspective, right? But we're seeing the traditional, I don't know if anybody's heard of the traditional sextortion schemes that, used to get those emails saying that, I've got your password and, I've probably got some pictures of you, and people would get really, really freaked out. Well, we're actually seeing the next version of that. And the next version of that is actually a deep fake video of an individual, right? And even though it's not real, but they say, hey, I'm going to leak this out to all your friends and family and tarnish your reputation. So something to consider if like that's the next advent of what we're starting to see from a cyber attacks perspective. Um, in looking at AI, again, we're starting to see AI being used obviously to build more sophisticated malicious code or malware, right? So even malware that can now learn and adapt, right? And make, using agentic AI, make actual certain decisions based on, the scenario that they're in or the network they're in, right? Which is, the next level of sophistication, right? And then we're seeing cyber criminals like, we're starting to see all these like machine learning algorithms and GPT versions that are being published online. And, there's a big community on GitHub that we see that people are contributing to. However, we're seeing cyber criminals actually poisoning those. So they're going into and they're maliciously modifying those to basically, maybe give you different results, right? And you might not even know, because I think the big thing about, the new version of ChatGPT, if you look at it, it actually tells you what the sources are. In the past, it used to not even tell you, like it just give you an answer, right? Now it actually tells you what the sources are. But how many people actually go and check, right? So something for you to consider, is the model that you're using, whether it's for machine learning or, for AI, has that been tampered? Like, do you really know that do you have any governance in your organization to ensure, or any policies to ensure that, it's being downloaded and verified from a legitimate source, right? Yeah. So, I said, with the advent of AI, and as I said, everything good, comes a little bit of evil, right? I don't see AI stealing your job, right? However, what they say is that it could be definitely be used to cause a very devastating impact to your organization, whether it's a cyber attack or a reputation impact. Hence, having proper governance, I think, is very, very critical.
Just
Uh,
before you keep going, there's just a
yeah,
quick question in the chat. It just says, how
sure.
does someone prove that a video is fake in case of a deep fake voice and video?
Yes, that is a very, very great question. And I think part of that is having, so what I usually say is to, some things to think about is, well, first of all, there's no real way to prove authenticity until, like, unless you actually go out publicly and say, well, that's not real, right? So, but what I will say is, I know there has been a lot of the new social media platforms are looking at ways to say, okay, is there a way to validate or verify, authenticity of content, right? And we still have many years, and even if there's not even any regulation yet around that. Like, the regulation is going to take many, many years to catch up, or laws. But what I will say is that as an organization, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when that incident's going to occur. I highly encourage you as an organization, if you haven't, look into, have a conversation with your PR firms. Like, if you have a PR company, what would we do? Have a playbook, think through the scenario, maybe even conduct a tabletop exercise and say, what would we do in this scenario? How would we respond? Like, what kind of holding message would we put out there? How would we deal, like, just like dealing with any other crises, right? Like, how would you deal with that? And part of that is, you need to have appropriate spokespersons in place, and, and have good relationships with, your, whether it's the news media or the social media providers in ahead of time, to then be able to, like, either take down that content or be able to, reputation manage or control any kind of damage, right? Yeah, it's a hard one because anybody can post whatever content that they want online, right? And it can spread like wildfire very, very quickly in these days, right? So
There's a few more that just
yeah,
entered the chat.
sure, no problem.
Um,
Yeah.
we've got three questions here. So the first one is, please provide an example of model tampering slash poisoning machine learning algorithm. How would a user know?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the I would say is, there's a lot of models that are, researchers that are publishing on like GitHub, which is like open source, anybody can download. It's just like any other open source software that was published in the past, right? Where people would publish the software. We've seen cases where, like open source software has been modified. And it's not anything, this attack is not new, right? This happened with software in the past, right? And so a couple of things is that, most providers will publish like a digital signature, which basically says, when you download this piece of software, verify and validate that this, the digital signature of the software that you download or the model you download is the same, right? The other piece is you got to kind of look at, well, you know, the place that you're downloading and do a little bit of research, which is just download something from the internet, right? And so the same practices around software apply. It's like, what's the reputation of the site you're downloading it? And I would even also, don't just blindly download something and use it. Understand like what the model is doing, and maybe even have it test it prior to like putting it into like a production environment, right? But I think given like a lot of the pressure sometimes organizations get, they just tend to like move to like, oh, I just see this really good AI model. I'm just going to download it, I'm going to use it, and I'm going to start using it for decision making, right? So I would say from a practice perspective, there's nothing new in terms of like the attack is new because now there's AI models being poisoned. And there's many instances of that. Like, if you just Google AI model poisoning, you'll see the number of types of attacks. Mannion publishes a lot of that. Mannion report actually will tell you, give you some very specific examples of the types of AI models that are being poisoned. But I would say is trust before you trust the source, like do your research and do your analysis, right? And validate and verify that what you're using is actually accurate, and then go through a testing process and see what the outputs are before you actually and this comes back to the governance, right? So if you need to have policies and governance around that, and I find that like a lot of organizations are missing those responsible AI governance policies.
Perfect. The next question is, do you have any data on countries where hackers originate from?
Yes, and actually, so me personally, yes, but I will say is that I encourage you is obviously the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity has published a 2025-2026 report on I won't say which specific countries, but you definitely, if you look at the report, there's definitely a couple of countries that stand out in terms of nation state actors where we see a lot of targeted attacks that are coming. They also publish a lot of details, analysis and details around just general cyber attacks where they're coming from as well. And then the other source that I highly recommend is, as I said, Google Mandiant, that they publish some really good reports there. There's also the Verizon data breach report that kind of also gives you some more details. But yeah, there are definitely, if if you're looking for very Canadian focus where attacks are coming from, highly recommend, the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. They do regularly publish some very good information on exactly where these attacks are coming from, based on, analysis of millions and millions of attacks that are coming, um,
Perfect. And last question for right now, and then we'll move on to the content a little bit more. Is VPN more secure than home internet when when you're working from home? And like, what are the basic steps that one would have to take in terms of making sure they're secure?
Yeah, so here's what I would say is definitely say, coming back to like, if you're logging from home and you're just on the open internet, right? Pretty much I would say a VPN is obviously helpful, like because it secures that connection, right? But it's not just the VPN, right? Also think about like what are the other types of controls you want to have. So you want to have some type of antivirus. You also want to make sure your machine's up to date and patched, right? So there's a couple of other things other than VPN that I'd highly recommend. But like, let's say, not too concerned if you're on a home connection, but if that home connection is shared now with like, I don't know if you have a tenant or something like that, well, definitely a VPN would definitely be more helpful. It also comes back to what is the type of business that you're doing. So if you're like visiting a banking site, or if you're just browsing the internet, like, less concerned. But if you're accessing, sensitive information, work information, then yes, you want to make sure that that connection is secure. I would highly recommend if you're connecting to like a local, like a coffee, if you're at a coffee shop or an airport, then highly recommend using VPN, because that will definitely make sure that you have a more secure connection, right? Um, what we're, uh, like I would say is there's some standard like cyber hygiene type of things that, I encourage you. Again, the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity publishes a lot of good information of what are some of the things that you can, that just as a general person should be able to do protect yourself from a cyber attack. Okay, just wanted to highlight some of the things that I wanted to highlight when we talked about automation. So we talked a little bit about AI. What I also wanted, when we talked a little bit about why we're seeing attacks getting faster. So we're seeing cyber criminals starting to use automation. So initially, it used to be a lot of people when they thought cyber criminals was that 14-year-old kid sitting in their basement hacking away, and that's what we saw in a lot of the movies and back in the days, right? But if you look at on the right hand side, there is a screenshot here, and this was a report that was conducted on one of the ransomware groups. It was called Conti ransomware. It's a couple of years old, but like what they did is they did a little bit of analysis of how this ransomware group was operating. And what we're starting to see is cyber criminals are becoming very, very sophisticated, and they actually operate more like companies and large organizations, and not like this 14-year-old script kiddie that was sitting in their basement suite, right? So when they actually did a deeper dive, we're starting to see that this group actually had different departments, and they had an IT department, and they had a department that was focused on like building code, like developers, and then they had mules that were, once they got the money, they were actually going and cashing it out at ATMs. And then they had, they were publishing jobs on the internet, and, actually recruiting people just like, a normal company would recruit, and HR departments, right? And then they had a separate group which was just managing the IT infrastructure, right? So you're starting to see, like, if anybody doesn't realize this, is that this is becoming a huge business, right? It's not just, a couple of guys sitting in their basement hacking away. It is actually, almost, and if you look at the number of profits and the ROI, 163% ROI, right? And they're making money in the millions and millions of dollars, right? Because they're not targeting, no longer they're just targeting one organization, they're targeting multiple organizations at the same time. How are they doing this? Automation, right? So what they're doing is they're taking the same attacks, and they're using automation to attack their websites. They're attacking simultaneously across multiple, deploying ransomware across multiple companies and negotiating with multiple companies at the same time, right? And the malware that they're putting in these systems are becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect. So this is, as I said, cyber criminals are starting to, take advantage of a lot of the automation to really maximize the amount of money and the effort that they're put in place, right? And when you look at a lot of, because if you look at it, the profitability of this is huge, right? So the purpose of what I wanted to really chat about is we're seeing the speed and we're seeing the pace of cyber attacks growing. We're seeing the use of advent of AI. We're seeing, the sophistication of attacks, and the number of attacks growing. We're seeing nation state attacks. We're seeing all kinds of cyber criminals making lots of money. Well, so it comes back to, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when your organization is going to get targeted, right? And you know, so what I would say is, whether it's an individual or a company or organization, you know, yes, you need to put in the basic level of governance in place. Like, so NIST has, the National Institutes of Standards of Technology. They have some really good frameworks on cybersecurity and other governance, overall corporate governance as well, around, what are these governance frameworks you need to put in, and board oversight, and that's all great, right? However, organizations really need to start thinking about taking a stance on, if I put in all those pieces and I miss one element of that, because the cyber criminals just need to find that one door into the organization, then considering that I am going to be compromised. I am going to be hit. I am going to be hit by a cyber incident. So if you take that mindset, cyber resilience is really all about, the mindset where an organization's ability to prepare, withstand, and recover, right? Because I know a lot of time in the past, it was all about, if you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's about, protect, detect, right? But I'm saying is that, yes, you still need to have those pieces. However, if you had limited funds and you really had to put focus, I would encourage you as an organization to put your efforts into cyber resilience, because this is usually forgotten, because people think, yeah, I have VPNs and I have antivirus and I have all this patching, but they forget about, okay, well, when an incident occurs, what am I going to do, right? And and you're starting to see this, whether it's the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity or NIST, they're publishing a lot of good information around what companies and organizations can do to move towards a more cyber resilience approach, right? And the whole concept of resilience is be able to, yes, you're going to be hit by a cyber incident, but what are some of the things that you can do very quickly or be prepared for so that when you do get hit by an incident, you can be backing up and running as fast as possible, right? And that's really what is key to being successful. The organizations that, we've seen very, very large organizations with millions and millions of dollars in investment in cybersecurity still get hit and compromised, right? Because, it's they find that one hole, that one employee that clicked on that phishing email, and that's what caused the incident, right? So, but the ones that were successful and did well after the cyber incident were the ones that focused on resilience, right? And that's really, my key message today, right? And so how do we really achieve resilience? And this is something for you as an organization to really think about. And I kind of look at resilience in these key steps. And the first step is really, looking at, okay, if tomorrow you were to kind of, sit down, if you had a cyber incident, what are some of the things that you can do to minimize the impact of that incident, right? How would you enhance your recovery capabilities? So, like, have you thought through like what are systems need to come up, and how do you recover from that? Uh, how do you maintain trust, right? So what does that mean? Like, what is, like, because if you look at a lot of the organizations that got hit by cyber incidents, customers lose trust, right? So it's not just the dollar figure. When I talked about that $4.5 million figure, it's not just about, that's just dealing with the incident. Now there's a whole trust factor, because if people lose trust in your organization for the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to lose all that business. How do you ensure that while you're going through that incident, you're continuing to maintain trust? And then what is that governance oversight that you need to put in place? And then how do you continue to adapt to these evolving threats? Because the threats are going to constantly keep changing. So when I look at resilience, these are the key factors. And I'll dig a little bit deeper into some of these items. Just a quick pause. Any questions so far?
It looks like there's two in the chat.
Okay.
The first one is, do you think typing in a website in a web browser is more safe than just typing it into Google? Because they see lots of people still type into Google to access like their bank.
Yeah, so that's a good, really good question. And something that we've seen with cyber attacks is that it's called search engine poisoning. So what they do is cyber criminals start to, like, their search engine poisoning is basically where they can increase the rating of a certain website over other websites, right? So let's say, when we saw this a while ago, and I know a lot of the big search engine providers now are starting to put some controls into it. But what we saw this is, let's say if you're going to bankxyz.com, and they would create a malicious website which looks identical to bankxyz.com, and they would do search engine poisoning so that the malicious website shows up higher in your search engine when you search for it over the legitimate XYZ website, right? And when you click on it, you think that you're going to the legitimate website because it looks the same, everything is the same, but you're actually not, right? So yes, that I would say good practice of actually, like, if you are using Google, like, look at what you're clicking on before you just click on it. Like, are you actually going to the legitimate site? Yes, you should also be, type it into the browser. However, keep in mind, the cyber criminals also get smart. So let's say if you're going to xyz.com, they'll create an xyz.ca or xyz, something that looks like xyz.com. And if you make an error, you might actually be going to a malicious website. So part of what I say to, anytime, what I encourage people is, don't just blindly trust when you're, and this is why a lot of people become, think they're typing something in Google and it's safe. Well, I say, yeah, it is, but you also need to trust but verify, right? So always be cautious about, like, well, how cyber criminals are using that trust factor to actually gain your confidence, right? And something that we see in phishing emails is, like, we see phone numbers and emails in the phishing emails, like don't trust that because usually they'll manipulate that, right? And so I always encourage go to the actual bank website or whatever if you get an email from them or something like that, right? So, okay, yeah. Any other questions?
The other question in the chat here is what resources are available to smaller or non-for-profit organizations with limited funds or access to expertise?
Okay, so I would say is it's a hard thing, right? Because I think smaller organizations typically don't have the same resources as larger, medium, or large size organization. But what I encourage you is, the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity, like if you're specifically looking for cyber related or governance perspective, like the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity does a lot of good work in that space. And a lot of times, like, they'll also point you to like there's a lot of things that are already done and they can help you provide that information. And they also have capabilities where they may be able to help you to a certain point or direct you to some funding that you can get help, right? The Canadian government is doing a lot of good work in that space, helping small and medium-sized businesses, becoming more cyber resilient, right? So there are some resources there, but I think it's what I would say with any company or organization from a governance perspective, it's a risk versus reward. And I think part of it, the first step is having that conversation with the leadership to say, you know, hey, just to let you know that we're a small organization, and a lot of times people think that small organizations are not targeted, but they are the ones actually we're starting to see smaller organizations are getting targeted because they don't have the same level of resources or sophistication as a larger organization. So they're easy prey. It's kind of how I see it, right? But the first step is having that conversation with the leadership or the owners of the companies to basically say is that if you don't invest in XYZ, and this is just like investing in marketing or investing in other pieces, it is going to have an impact on your overall operations. It's going to have an impact on reputation. So if you're trying to grow your organization, this becomes cost of doing business, right? And you should at least, maybe you don't need to be at the level of sophistication as a medium to large, but at least you need to start doing some very basic things. And those basic things are actually, if you go to this Canadian Center of Cybersecurity, it talks about what are the 5 or 10 basic things that you can do from a cybersecurity perspective. Okay. So yeah, so we chatted about minimizing the impact of cyber incidents. So coming back to governance, so some things to consider is if you're working with an organization and you're looking at governance, some of the things that I would highly encourage, recommending to your company or organization if they already don't have this, is number one is having some type of data protection policy or data strategy around the organization of how you're understanding what data you have, and then having some type of data protection standard or policy around that. Because if you look at a lot of these like these attacks, the first level of attack is like they would deploy ransomware, so they shut down your systems and you can't use it. But the second type of attack, when we talk about, the double extortion, is what they're really interested in is stealing your data. So, and this is where the reputation impact and the damage happens. So what they do is they'll steal your customer data or your internal data or even internal employee data, and they'll threaten to publish that externally. So highly encourage you, if you haven't gone through this exercise, I know it's not always simple, but having some analysis or at least understanding what data you have and what is the reputation damage if that data were to be breached, right? The second piece, what I highly encourage organizations to do, and is to having a business continuity plan. Now, when we look at business continuity, people think about, oh, earthquakes, natural disasters, right? And definitely, I think on the West Coast here, like I would say is, we've already had some tremors and earthquakes. So yes, you need to consider that. But I also almost think about it, the likelihood of you getting hit by a cyber incident is probably very higher than like getting hit by an earthquake, right? So when you look at business continuity, I would highly encourage you to look at if your systems, because in a cyber incident, typically they would last anywhere between minimum downtime would be 5 to 15 days, anywhere between that. And that's typically looking at most cyber incidents. So if you're down and your systems are like completely down, how does your business continue to operate? Because everybody is now dependent on digitization and digital transformation projects. Well, can your business operate without technology? And I think that's something that a lot of companies haven't thought through. And these are the ones I'm saying, the ones that do well and don't do well. Like if you have gone through business continuity, which each one of your business areas, and help them walk through like a tabletop exercise and have a plan in place, you'll do come out of really well in a cyber incident, right? And then the next part of that is crisis management, right? So once you have your business continuity, well, okay, now that you have a crisis, whether it's a cyber incident or any type of other, whether it's a reputation damage, we talked about that, deep fakes or something like that. How are you dealing with that crisis? Do you have a crisis communication plan? Like, do you have a PR company? Are you working through like what are all the like who's your spokesperson? Like, do you know, do you have a policy in place around what employees are going to say, or what are you going to tell them, right? So I think that would all go into the crisis management, right? So I would say is from an overall governance perspective, highly recommend if your organization doesn't have these pieces is, something for you to consider. Um, when we look at recovery capabilities, something for, around when we look at risk mitigation, I highly encourage you if your technical teams or businesses haven't thought through, is really understand from a business operations perspective, what are the things that need to stay on and what are what are the things that you stay on, what are the things that can't not stay on, right? By in 9 out of 10 times, if you're hit by ransomware, all your data is encrypted, right? So you can't like unless you pay the ransomware or pay the ransom, which could be like $5 to $10 million. There was a recent incident where the ransomware demand was $25 to $30 million, right? And we're seeing that increase based on the size. Because what a lot of cyber criminals do is they don't just randomly give you a number. They'll do a lot of research on like how much how much does a company make? What are your profits? They'll go through like like almost look at your CRMs and like say, well, how much is this organization making in profits? And then based on that, can they afford it, right? So, so sometimes paying the ransom might be the right choice. However, I would say is that there's no guarantees because you may or may not get the data back, right? So ensuring that you're back, like from an overall governance perspective, is your critical data backed up? And even personally, I would say, whether it's not even an organization, personally as an individual, we all store data like, our photos and important documents. Is that data backed up somewhere? Because you could personally get hit by a ransomware too. So, are you backing up your data? Are you using some kind of automation to continuously back up and recover? And then are you conducting any kind of tabletops or exercises to test and validate, right? That backups can be recovered and are the systems operational, right? So from an overall governance perspective, these three key elements are very, very key to being able to recover faster, right? And then we chatted a little bit about trust. So part of trust is, if you look at some of the organizations that had to deal with different type of crises, and the crises could, it's not always about a cyber incident. It could be, it could be like, I think there was an incident where an airline had to deal with a significant, like an airline issue, like a plane issue, right? We had, a transit company that had to deal with an emergency under transit aspect, right? Or as an organization, you might have to deal with deepfakes, right? So part of managing and maintaining trust, the organizations that did extremely well in maintaining that trust were the ones that had a very good like crisis communications plan. And part of that was they had a holding message immediately, and it's timely communication. Because if you think about it, I'm sure we all have been notified by some company, hey, your data was breached and we're offering you credit monitoring, and you're like super frustrated. You're like, why do I even do business with them? And I don't really trust their. But the ones that do well and the ones that don't do well, the ones that do well are the ones that are open, transparent, and timely, and have been acknowledged their mistake, because everybody makes mistakes, or nobody can be perfect. And the ones that are on the ball and are able to constantly being able to give you the updates. The one, and today in these, in the social media world, you know, disinformation or misinformation can fly really, really fast, right? So having that ability to monitor that and be able to deal with that in a very prompt manner is very key in managing and maintaining that trust when you're going through a crisis, right? And then finally, when we, speaking to a lot of governance professionals here, I would highly encourage you is that having that board oversight, right, around ask those questions, some of these elements that we chatted about here, working with the board, working with your governance teams, conducting annual assessments, right? Really understanding what your legal and regulatory compliance obligations are, because a lot of times people forget, in an event of an incident, you might have to report to the privacy commissioner. There may be some financial regulations, timelines, SLAs, some legal obligations with other companies. So really understanding what those are and, incorporating that into your tabletop exercises. And then, and the key is, having overall strong risk management across the organization, right? So that people understand that, yeah, this incident will occur, but the last thing you want to do is if you've gone through these processes before, people are more well prepared and understand which risks they can accept, which risks they won't, cannot accept, and what would they need to do, right? So yeah, and I think what I would say to this is the for corporate governance really, and I'm sure this is right from the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada, like for really corporate governance to be really to be effective is making sure that your board and your senior leadership is bought into this, right? This mindset. And so part of that is like first step, a lot of people ask me like how do you go down this path on ensuring cyber resilience? And I would say is first step is educating them. Start with educating, help them understand the risk, maybe even bring in some recent examples of companies similar to yours that have been hit by cyber incidents and what the impacts have been. Work with them to build a framework of like what their role of oversight model would be, because some boards like to be like really involved, some boards don't, right? um, you know, Establish that relationship and that understand what that reporting, if there's incidents they'd like to be reported to, what does that timely reporting look like, and really work with them to get them to champion it. Because I would say is your leadership needs to champion. You can't be the one like pushing it up. I think it needs to be top down, and part of that is, you need to get buy-in from right from the highest level leadership that this is important to the organization, and it's really critical to the overall success of the organization, right? And I think we chatted a little bit about evolving threats. So these threats are going to constantly keep evolving. Today it's AI. We're seeing the advent of agentic AI. Uh, what I would say is, yeah, there's an element of like you want to make sure your employees are educated and trained, and the general practices around pen testing or simulations that you do. However, a lot of people forget is the real key is learning from incidents. We go through an incident or go through a tabletop exercise. Are you really learning and really, taking the lessons learned and adapting and evolving and ensuring that there's a continuous management, continuous improvement framework that's put in place, right? And that's the piece that I find a lot of organizations, they document it, they have a lessons learned, but it just goes and gets shelved away. So, and a lot of organizations that I've seen that have been hit by cyber incidents, they already knew that they had that gap, but they just didn't do anything about it, right? So from an overall governance perspective, is there an, like, coming back to strong risk management, is there an ability to, if you are you learning and are you actually following up and closing the loop there? I know we have 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to take a quick pause and I wanted to see if there's any final questions, anything more that I can add to this. Key takeaway I would say today is if you haven't thought through cyber resilience, highly encourage you to start thinking through that mindset, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when your company or organization will get hit. And it's a mindset. You got to shift the mindset, because people's mindset is, oh, how do I protect? How do I protect? And I'm not saying don't do the protection piece, but start thinking about, okay, I almost start thinking it's going to happen. What do I now need to do when it does happen? I think you'll be in a way better place.
Okay, there is a question in the Q&A at the moment. It's a question about email communication. So it says most directors have a personal email, not a corporate email. This implies to the company whether they're asking whether an email like Shaw or TELUS is better than an email host on Google or Outlook.
Yeah, so the challenge with email, well, I wouldn't say like, Shaw is better than Google or anything like that. Like I would say is that in the end of the day, like um what I would say is if you're using email for like, for business purposes, right? You just got to be cautious because what we're starting to see is that anybody can create an email with, with Shaw or Google, right? So we're seeing this with impersonation, right? And we're starting to see a lot of this across executives of the organizations where what they do is they'll create an email that John Smith at I don't know Google.com or whatever, and send an email to the employees pretending to be that individual and asking them to run some errands or send them some confidential sensitive information. What I would say is if you do receive an email from somebody, have that, it's kind of like if you get that gut feeling like, hey, there's something wrong, like, or they're asking me to do something, like it's usually a sense of like urgency, or they're asking you for something sensitive. Validate and verify that it is that person. And sometimes what I always say is pick up the phone and like validate, hey, is it really you that's asking me that information, right? And don't use the phone number in the email because the bad guy will probably put a phone number that belongs to them. It's like, so kind of sometimes the way I always say is if you're getting something that is the first time and you don't expect it, always use another way to validate, right? Because we've seen this all the time. I started with an organization with my new organization, and within like the first couple of months, I got an email from my CEO asking me to do a bunch of stuff, and I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, that's not actually the CEO. It's actually someone else pretending to be somebody. But because your email addresses are all available on Google, like or sorry, like on the internet or LinkedIn, right? So the bad guys know how to get a hold of that, right? But what I would say is if you ever get an email from somebody and it kind of is unexpected, think about, okay, is this person really saying what they're saying, and is there another way for me to validate? But
Okay.
coming back to, I think the original question around usually if it's a company email compared to like a Google or Shaw, companies tend to have better controls than, just somebody being able to, because anybody can create a Shaw or a Google email, right? Address.
Okay, a whole flood of questions came in. So if you're okay to stay on for a couple extra
Yeah, no
minutes for
problem.
some of the people. Just before we get to those questions, I am going to thank everybody for coming today. We will stay on for a couple questions, but for anybody who doesn't want to ask questions or anything like that, you are free to leave. We do have another CPD webinar coming up on May 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern. It's looking at corporate versus not-for-profit boards and how they're more alike than you might actually think. As usual, there will be a feedback survey after the session, so please take a moment to fill that out because it always helps us. As well, the recording for this, as well as the presentation slides, will be available on the YouTube channel as well as the website within 1 week. So anybody who doesn't want to stick around for questions, please feel free to log off. And as for everyone else, let's start getting into these questions. So the first one here is, could you please discuss risks of using different AI platforms such as ChatGPT, DeepSeek, which is best to avoid?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to the organization's risk tolerance, right? So what I would say is, first of all, for any organization to use any AI tool, highly encourage you to have like some kind of responsible AI policy, right? And part of that is because with use of any AI, there is a number of different risks. One is like, biases, like a lot of times people don't think about that. There's the risk of data leakage, right? Because you could accidentally put like confidential information into these, right? Into these AI tools. Also, guardrails around decision making because AI tools are still fairly new and may not actually give you like full accurate information, right? However, when we look at different AI models, whether it's ChatGPT or any other AI tool, I would say is sometimes it comes back to when I say do the risk assessment for your organization. There are, these AI tools are sometimes run in different companies, different countries, right? And if your company has any kind of regulations around, where your data can be or what type of tools or technologies you can use, you then that will influence your decision, right? Over the other, right? Um, you know, I think it all comes back to the overall risk tolerance of the organization, and making sure that you have appropriate responsible AI policy.
Perfect. The next question here is considering the low rate of convictions become necessary for all organizations.
Sorry, they just froze there. Could you just repeat that question? Yeah.
So it was considering the low rate of convictions, prosecutions, and recoveries in relation to cyber attacks,
Mhm.
has cyber insurance become necessary for all organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what I would say is cyber insurance is not the answer, I would say. It's kind of like because what we're starting to see is cyber insurance companies are also becoming they're asking for more and more, more and more details about, and more controls within organizations before they even insure you, right? So I'm not saying that you should have a cyber insurance, right? But we're also seeing like a lot of organizations getting declined by cyber insurance as well too, because it's like any other insurance, right? Like you buy the insurance, and I think the way how I consider cyber insurance is like that yes, it's there, it's a good due diligence. However, there may be a likelihood that they may find stipulation or something in the wording of the cyber insurance where you may not be covered, right? So it's a precautionary measure, a risk mitigation measure, but it shouldn't be the only measure, right? And I think a lot of times people have kind of taken that to extreme. They're like, oh, I'm not going to go and invest all this time and effort in building a cybersecurity program or governance program, and I'm just going to go buy insurance. Well, they found out the hard way is that the insurance companies come in and they did a review or an audit, and they said, well, you don't even have basic cybersecurity hygiene or controls, and I'm sorry, but our insurance policy says we're going to decline you. So if you do have cyber insurance, highly encourage you to work with your cyber insurer to understand what your obligations are, just like any other insurance, like, it's kind of, I say, going back to the pre-existing medical conditions. Like if you have pre-existing medical conditions, like, if you have heart issues, they're not going to cover you if you have a heart attack, right? So understand what those pre-existing conditions are in your organization and what controls and things you need to have, and read through the fine prints of your cyber insurer, and have that understanding and build that relationship prior so you know what's going to be covered or not. But it's not a replacement, I would say. It is you still need to do and implement basic cyber hygiene and keep up with some of these pieces. And then on top of that, there may be a likelihood that you may be covered for some or part or some of those costs, right? So, but definitely, some of these costs that we're seeing the reputation damage is like, yeah, that's definitely not covered by cyber insurance.
Perfect. Okay, we have four more questions and then I'll cut it off. Um, how are you implementing cyber resilience in your role today? What are some strategies that you use?
Yeah, so so coming back to like the presentation that I was talking about, so some of the things that we've been doing in our organization is working through, as you said, like working with our leadership and executive and getting buy-in and understanding for them to understand the seriousness and the risk. So that's number one. So really creating that awareness with our leadership and our board. The next is doing tabletop exercises, right? Like with our leadership team, and then so then it's kind of like muscle memory. Like you don't want to be waiting for a crisis to happen and then being able to like get people together and what are we going to do? So working through those scenarios and then helping them understand. We also have predefined playbooks, and we have a crisis communication plan, right, that we've developed. But again, I said, like these are just things to prepare, right? So I think there's a lot of preparation. That doesn't mean that, an organization's not going to get hit by an incident or not going to have an incident. However, coming back to my original point, if you look at a lot of the one organizations and, large organizations that have been hit by any type of crises, the ones that do well and the ones that don't do well, the ones that did well were the ones that prepared, right? And it's kind of like going back to the old mindset that we had around, we used to with earthquakes and we used to do like building evacuations and drills. And part of that is creating that muscle memory so that if something happens, a fire or earthquake or whatever, we all know how to evacuate, right? Same thing comes with like building resilience and mindset with your company just in a different way. Like, how would we react to this type of scenario? What would we do? How would we get together? And what is our holding message? What would we communicate? How often would we communicate? Who do we need to reach out to, right? So when we talk about building cyber resilience, coming back to some of those steps that we talked about is really looking at those steps and say, okay, have we done these pieces? Have we considered? Have we backed up our data, right? Do we even know what type of data we have, right? So hopefully, yeah, that answers that question.
Yep. Next, as cyber criminals use AI are very fast and evolving, are our cyber laws also changing at that speed? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I wish, right? I wish we could have like a cyber law GPT that could just like, or that could create these laws and also like pass them through Parliament. But yeah, I think it's just like any other, the laws and the regulations are coming. I'm not saying they aren't. We're seeing a lot of it within the EU and in other countries. However, it will take time because the laws always take time to catch up and regulations take time to catch up. Definitely, not at the speed or the pace of what we're seeing, as things evolve, right? But I wouldn't hold yourself back because of that, just because we don't have a law or regulation. I would say is, understand, do a risk assessment in your organization, understand what the level of risk is, and then based on that build your plan or your strategy for your organization. And then when the laws do catch up, I think there's it's all good, right? But I would say is it will take time, right? Just like everything else, like every other, I think initially way back in the days, it used to be around data privacy, and it took many many years for the even until today, like we're starting to see the laws are still trying to catch up, right?
Okay, what are your thoughts on vendor lock?
Um, so yeah, so I think that's a good question. And sometimes like you're locked in. So I'm thinking from a perspective where, from the questions perspective, you're locked in the vendor. How would you deal with that scenario? I would say is, part of it is, is having that conversation and communication with the vendor, right? Because if they're hit by an incident, it's and it's their product, then it's a reputation damage not only for your organization but for them. So it's a hard one because if you can't exit that vendor, you have to be working with that vendor, and part of that is trying to build that relationship with them and having those risk conversations with their leadership team to really say, hey, here's what we're concerned about. I understand there's challenges, but what are some, you may not be able to get everything, but at least maybe first step is creating awareness. Second step is, are they abilities to, negotiate and say, okay, what are some critical things that can be done? I also would also encourage you, is there an ability to negotiate legal terms? I know sometimes it's hard if you're locked in with that vendor, but sometimes there's room for, and I would even start with, hey, there is a cyber incident. Are you able to disclose that within X number of hours? Because a lot of people don't even have that in their contracts, right? Or are you willing to work towards like a SOC 2 type 2, which is like a certification on, their overall coverage, like cybersecurity coverage, right? Because it's a win-win for both of us. So I know it's a hard one when you're locked in with a vendor and you don't have a choice, but I think what I would say is this is where regulation can help because then you can point them to regulation. But if you don't have regulation, the only opportunity there is to see if there is opportunity to work with them and negotiate and help them understand the risk, right? Because they're going to be impacted by that reputation risk as well too.
Okay, and very last question, and then we'll let everyone go. Um, are there any good resources for removing one's old accounts and signups from the internet?
Yeah, there's a number of services that you can buy these days, and a lot of the major, like whether it's Equifax or some of the big like credit TransUnion, or there's even like other companies that offer like dark web monitoring and offer like services such as like they will let you know what they've found on the internet or what they've found about you as a person, or and are able to notify you, right? um in terms of like removal, I think there are companies that will say that they will, but I think what I've seen is the likelihood of that is so low, right? As an organization, we see like these fake malicious sites pop up all the time. And we try to work with some companies to take them down, but some of these are like in third world countries or some like other countries that don't have laws, right? And it's really, really hard, right? And or sometimes they are on servers or systems where the business model is that like they want to be hosting that information, so it's really hard like for them because they're losing profitability when you ask them to do stuff. So what I would say to that is that there are services. So I would start with like the a more reputable company or organization, such as don't just go with any service provider because they'll just steal your information. So I would say is like start with like Equifax or TransUnion, and they offer like dark web monitoring services. And then once you've discovered that, I would say there are uh, I don't want to be recommending a particular vendor, but there are some really reputable vendors that you can like, do your research on and say, okay, these are the companies you can use to like pull some of that information out from the internet. But it's not guaranteed, I'll tell you that. Okay, and this is why I always say is that be careful when you post something on the internet, it's there forever, right?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you everyone for
Yeah.
sticking around for the questions and everything and for all the interaction with us. I'm sure we love all the questions and everything. With that, I am going to say have a wonderful day, everyone. And again, don't forget to join us next time and fill out our survey. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank